On a calm January night in 2012, a floating city was dying. The Costa Concordia, all 290 meters of her, hung tilted against a rocky Italian shoreline, her 13 decks listing so steeply that passengers couldn't stand. Emergency lights flickered through salt spray. Somewhere in the darkness, a Coast Guard captain screamed into his radio at a ship's captain who had already abandoned his vessel. "Vada a bordo, cazzo!" Get back on board. The man refused. Hours earlier, this same ship had been serving 5-course dinners in crystal chandeliers glow. Waiters in pressed uniforms had glided between tables. A pianist had played soft jazz in the atrium bar. 4,252 people were enjoying the first night of a Mediterranean cruise, settling into their cabins, exploring the endless corridors, photographing the spectacular public spaces. Then, a sound like tearing metal, a shudder through the hull. The lights went out. In an age of GPS navigation, satellite communication, and safety regulations refined over a century of maritime disasters, the Costa Concordia ran directly into charted rocks less than 500 meters from shore. Not in a storm, not due to mechanical failure, not because of any equipment malfunction, because her captain wanted to give the passengers a show. 32 people died that night. And when the sun rose over Isola del Giglio the next morning, the world saw something it had never seen before. A modern cruise ship, 3 football fields long and weighing more than 100,000 tons, lying on her side in shallow water like a beached whale. The largest passenger ship disaster since the Titanic. To understand how this happened, how a floating resort that cost over $500 million to build ended up as the most expensive shipwreck in history, we need to go back to the moment when cruise ships stopped being transportation and became destinations. Back to the design decisions that created a palace at sea. Back to the daily rhythms of life aboard a vessel that promised paradise. And back to the career of a captain who believed he knew better than his navigation systems. This is the story of a disaster that never should have happened. The cruise industry that created Costa Concordia barely existed a generation before her launch. In the 1960s and 1970s, ocean liners were dying. Jet aircraft had made transatlantic crossings obsolete. The great ships that once carried passengers between continents, vessels with names like Queen Mary, United States, and France, found themselves without purpose. Some were scrapped. Others were converted to floating hotels, permanently docked in harbors where they served as tourist attractions. A few visionaries saw a different future. What if the journey itself became the destination? The insight seems obvious now, but it represented a fundamental reimagining of what a ship could be. Traditional ocean liners had been designed for speed and efficiency. Their purpose was to transport passengers from one port to another as quickly and safely as possible. Entertainment existed, but it was secondary to the voyage itself. Cabins were often cramped, designed for sleeping rather than living. Public spaces accommodated passengers who needed somewhere to pass the time during a crossing that might last a week. The modern cruise ship inverted these priorities entirely. Speed became irrelevant. These vessels would sail in circles, returning to their home ports after touring the Caribbean or Mediterranean. The journey had no practical purpose whatsoever. Every element of the ship could be designed purely for pleasure. The transformation began gradually. Carnival Corporation, an American company that had started with a single converted transatlantic liner in 1972, pioneered what they called the fun ship concept. Their vessels featured onboard casinos, elaborate entertainment programs, and dining options that went far beyond the traditional ship's galley. They marketed cruises not as transportation, but as all-inclusive resort vacations that happened to float. By the late 1990s, the industry had transformed itself completely. Ships had grown from modest vessels carrying a few hundred passengers to floating cities accommodating thousands. The amenities had expanded to include ice skating rinks, rock climbing walls, surf simulators, Broadway-style theaters, and specialty restaurants helmed by celebrity chefs. Cruise passengers were no longer travelers enduring a sea voyage. They were vacationers enjoying a resort that visited new ports every day. Carnival Corporation had become the largest cruise operator in the world, and they were hungry for growth. In 2000, Carnival's Italian subsidiary, Costa Concordia, announced an ambitious expansion plan. Over the next decade, they would invest more than 4 billion euros in new ships, positioning Costa as Europe's dominant cruise line. The Mediterranean's share of global cruise passengers was expanding rapidly, from just under 12% in 2000 to over 18% by the end of the decade. European travelers who might once have booked beach holidays in Spain or Greece were discovering that a cruise offered something different, a vacation where you unpacked once and woke up in a new destination every morning, all while enjoying amenities that most hotels couldn't match. Costa intended to capture that growth with vessels larger and more luxurious than anything Europe had seen before. The first ship in this new fleet would be called Concordia. The name means harmony in Italian, a statement of the company's vision for unity among European nations. The ship would embody European elegance while offering the scale and amenities that American cruise lines had pioneered. Costa ordered her in January 2004 from Fincantieri, Italy's premier shipbuilder, at a cost of 450 million euros. She would be the largest cruise ship ever built in Italy and one of the largest under any European flag. Construction took place at Fincantieri's historic Sestri Ponente shipyard, nestled in the hills west of Genoa. The yard had been building ships since the 1800s, and its workers brought generations of maritime expertise to the project. Over 2 years, Costa Concordia took shape. Her massive hull assembled from thousands of prefabricated sections, her superstructure rising deck by deck, her interiors fitted with the materials and furnishings that would transform her from a steel shell into a floating palace. When Costa Concordia slid down the ways at Sestri Ponente on September 2, 2005, something unusual happened. Czech supermodel Eva Herzegová had been invited to perform the traditional christening ceremony. She swung the champagne bottle against the hull with practiced grace. It didn't break. Among seafarers, this is considered a terrible omen. A ship that isn't properly christened is thought to be cursed, doomed to misfortune. The assembled dignitaries shifted uncomfortably. Herzegová swung again, harder this time. The bottle shattered, champagne foam cascading down the bow, and the crowd applauded with relief. But superstitious crew members would remember that failed christening. They would remember it in November 2008 when the ship was pushed against a dock in Palermo during high winds, damaging her bow. And they would remember it on January 13, 2012. If you could have walked the decks of Costa Concordia in her prime, you would have understood why people called her a floating city. The ship's vital statistics alone convey something of her scale. At just over 952 feet long, that's 290 meters, she stretched nearly the length of 3 American football fields laid end to end. Her beam, or width, was 116 feet, and she rose more than 150 feet from waterline to the top of her funnel. Her gross tonnage, a measurement of internal volume rather than weight, was 114,500 compared to the Titanic's 46,000. She could have swallowed the most famous shipwreck in history and had room to spare. Costa Concordia drew nearly 27 feet of water fully loaded and could reach speeds of 23 knots, roughly 26 miles per hour. Her diesel-electric power plant, consisting of 6 massive Wärtsilä 12-cylinder engines, generated 75,600 kilowatts of electricity, enough to power a small city. That electricity drove not only her propulsion, but every system aboard. The air conditioning that kept passengers comfortable in Mediterranean heat, the kitchens that prepared thousands of meals daily, the theaters and cinemas, the elevators and escalators, the lighting that transformed her into a beacon visible for miles at sea. But statistics only hint at the experience. To truly understand Costa Concordia, you had to walk her decks. Passengers arriving at the ship typically boarded on Deck 4, which the ship's designers had named Greece. The naming convention carried throughout the vessel. Each of the 13 passenger decks bore the name of a European nation, a subtle reinforcement of the Concordia theme of European harmony. Deck 5 was Italia, Deck 6 was Germania. By the time passengers reached Deck 12, they had ascended through Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, Britain, Belgium, and Ireland to arrive at Francia. The moment of arrival set the tone for everything that followed. Passengers stepped from the gangway into an atrium that rose through multiple decks, a soaring vertical space designed to overwhelm the senses. The floor was polished marble in cream and gold tones. Brass railings gleamed under crystal chandeliers that scattered light across every surface. Glass elevators rose along one wall, offering views of the grand staircase that curved upward through the ship's heart. Live plants softened the space, their greenery a striking contrast to the surrounding ocean. This atrium served as the ship's emotional center, the first and last impression for every passenger, the space where daily life converged. Reception desks staffed by multilingual officers handled questions and requests. Comfortable seating areas invited passengers to linger, watching the parade of their fellow travelers. In the evenings, a pianist or small ensemble performed, their music drifting upward through the open decks. From the atrium, passengers could explore in any direction, and what they found depended entirely on their interests. For those seeking dining, Costa Concordia offered 5 distinct restaurants, each with its own character and cuisine. The main dining rooms, located on decks 3 and 4, could accommodate more than 1,000 guests at a single seating. Tables for 2 lined the windows, offering ocean views, while larger tables filled the interior spaces. The decor was classic Italian elegance: white tablecloths, heavy silverware, wine glasses that caught the light. Menus changed nightly, featuring Italian specialties alongside international cuisine, with multiple courses served by waiters who learned passengers' preferences over the course of a voyage. For passengers who wanted something more intimate, the Club Concordia offered reservations-only dining in a sophisticated atmosphere. Tables were more widely spaced. Service was more attentive. The menu featured elevated Italian cuisine with wine pairings selected by the ship's sommelier. It was the kind of restaurant that might have earned recognition in a European city. But here, it floated across the Mediterranean, its kitchen preparing dishes as the ship sailed from port to port. The Samsara restaurant catered to passengers who had booked the ship's premium spa accommodations. Named for the Buddhist concept of the cycle of rebirth, it offered lighter, healthier fare, designed to complement the spa experience. Vegetables were fresher, preparation was simpler, and the emphasis was on nutrition alongside taste. Passengers in Samsara suites could take every meal here, maintaining their wellness regimen, even while on vacation. For casual dining, the ship offered a massive buffet on the upper decks, open for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and late-night snacking. Stations offered everything from carved meats to fresh pasta prepared to order, from Asian cuisine to pizza emerging from wood-fired ovens. Passengers could fill their plates and find seating indoors or outside on the surrounding deck, watching the sea slide past as they ate. And throughout the ship, 13 bars offered drinks and atmosphere for every taste. A cigar and cognac lounge provided leather armchairs and hushed conversation for those seeking old-world refinement. A coffee and chocolate bar served espresso alongside handmade Italian confections. Poolside bars mixed tropical cocktails for passengers fresh from swimming. A wine bar offered tastings of Italian vintages. Each venue had its own design vocabulary, its own mood, its own regular clientele among the passengers. Entertainment options were equally diverse. The ship's main theater, the Teatro Atene, rose through 3 full decks in the forward section of the vessel. Its stage could accommodate Broadway-caliber productions with full sets, elaborate costumes, and professional lighting. The technical capabilities matched any land-based theater: fly systems for moving scenery, orchestra pits for live musicians, sound systems engineered for acoustic clarity throughout the vast space. Each voyage featured multiple shows, from musical reviews to magic acts to visiting performers. Near the theater, a casino offered the usual array of gaming tables and slot machines, its design suggesting a Monte Carlo gambling hall transplanted to sea. The clatter of chips and electronic chimes provided a constant backdrop for passengers trying their luck. Italian law required the casino to close while the ship was in Italian territorial waters, but once Concordia sailed into international space, the games ran day and night. A futuristic disco occupied one of the upper decks, its design all curved surfaces and colored lights, its sound system capable of filling the space with throbbing bass. It came alive after midnight, when younger passengers and crew members off duty gathered to dance. A cinema offered current films in multiple languages. A library provided quiet space for reading. A card room hosted bridge tournaments and poker games. For passengers seeking physical activity, the options began at the Samsara Spa. This was not a typical ship's fitness center. Costa Concordia's spa covered more than 64,000 square feet across 2 levels, making it one of the largest wellness facilities ever constructed at sea. The main level featured a full gymnasium with cardio equipment, weight machines, and free weights. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the ocean, allowing passengers to run on treadmills while watching the horizon. Professional trainers offered classes throughout the day: aerobics, yoga, Pilates, spinning, and strength training. Beyond the gym, the spa proper began. A thalassotherapy pool, a specialized treatment using heated seawater, occupied a central position, its jets massaging tired muscles, while mineral-rich water promoted circulation. Surrounding it were saunas in the Finnish tradition, Turkish steam baths, thick with eucalyptus-scented vapor, and relaxation rooms where passengers could rest between treatments. Private treatment rooms lined the spa's corridors, their doors leading to massage tables, facial stations, and body treatment facilities. The spa menu offered dozens of services: Swedish massage, hot stone therapy, aromatherapy, anti-aging facials, seaweed wraps, couples treatments. Passengers who had booked Samsara suites received priority access, but any guest could reserve treatments. The premium Samsara accommodations themselves represented the highest level of luxury aboard. 55 cabins and suites featured direct access to the spa, allowing guests to move from their staterooms to treatments without entering public corridors. These rooms featured special amenities: purifying shower filters, essential oil diffusers, kettles with selections of Ayurvedic teas. Guests received bathrobes and slippers, priority restaurant reservations, and complimentary access to spa facilities that other passengers paid to use. Outside the spa, the sun decks offered their own attractions. 4 swimming pools spread across the upper decks, 2 of them featuring retractable glass roofs that could shelter passengers from wind or light rain while still providing natural light. 5 jacuzzis bubbled at the pool's edges, their warm water contrasting with the cooler pool temperatures. A poolside movie screen allowed passengers to watch films from deck chairs while attendants brought drinks from nearby bars. A jogging track circled the ship's perimeter, allowing fitness enthusiasts to run laps while watching the ocean pass. A basketball court and tennis court occupied deck space for more competitive exercise. A Grand Prix racing simulator let passengers experience famous circuits from behind the wheel of a virtual racing car, their times posted on leaderboards that encourage competition throughout each voyage. For children, dedicated facilities occupied several areas of the ship. The Squawk Club provided supervised activities for young passengers, art projects, games, treasure hunts, and age-appropriate entertainments. Video game rooms featured the latest consoles. Teen clubs offered spaces where adolescents could socialize away from their parents. The programming was extensive, allowing families to cruise together while giving parents time to enjoy adult amenities. The accommodations ranged from compact inside cabins to sprawling luxury suites. The most basic inside cabins measured approximately 150 square feet, tight quarters, but efficiently designed. 2 lower beds could be configured as twins or pushed together to form a queen. A small sitting area provided seating and a desk. A private bathroom included a shower, toilet, and sink. Storage was sufficient for a week's vacation if passengers packed carefully. These cabins had no windows, but their lower price point made cruising accessible to budget-conscious travelers. Outside cabins added windows, either portholes in lower categories or larger picture windows in premium rooms, bringing natural light and ocean views into the space. Square footage increased modestly to perhaps 175 or 190 square feet. The additional cost was significant, but, for many passengers, worth every euro for the connection to the sea beyond. Balcony cabins represented a significant step up. More than 500 cabins aboard Costa Concordia featured private verandas, glass doors opening onto small outdoor spaces where passengers could sit in the morning with coffee, watching the ship approach a new port, or in the evening, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. The cabins themselves were larger, perhaps 210 square feet, with the balcony adding another 40 or 50 square feet of usable space. Many passengers, once they experienced a balcony cabin, never booked anything else. The suites occupied the top of the hierarchy. 58 suites featured private balconies, generous living spaces, and amenities that passengers in lesser accommodations couldn't access. The largest suites approached 450 square feet, with separate living rooms, marble bathrooms with full tubs, and furnishings that would have been at home in a luxury hotel. Butler service was included, a dedicated attendant who handled unpacking and packing, made reservations, delivered breakfast, and attended to whatever needs arose. Suite passengers ate in exclusive restaurants, embarked and disembarked through priority lines, and generally experienced a different ship than passengers in the main accommodations. Below the passenger areas, hidden from the vacationers above, was another world entirely. The engine rooms occupied the lowest decks, vast spaces filled with the 6 generating sets that powered everything aboard. Engineers monitored gauges and computer screens around the clock, watching temperatures, pressures, fuel consumption, and electrical output. The noise was tremendous. The constant throb of massive engines, the whine of generators, the hum of pumps moving fuel and water throughout the ship. This was the heart that kept the floating city alive, and the engineers who tended it rarely interacted with the passengers whose comfort depended on their expertise. The galleys spread across multiple decks, industrial kitchens capable of producing thousands of meals daily. Walk-in refrigerators stored ingredients for the week. Prep areas filled with cooks chopping vegetables and butchering meat. Cooking lines featured commercial ovens, griddles, fryers, and ranges. Pastry chefs prepared desserts in dedicated sections. The logistics were staggering, coordinating multiple restaurants serving different menus, producing room service around the clock, managing special dietary requirements, and doing it all while the floor moved beneath your feet. Crew quarters occupied sections of the ship that passengers never saw. More than 1,000 crew members lived aboard, their cabins far smaller than passenger accommodations, their common areas functional rather than luxurious. Many crew members worked contracts of 6 months or longer, seeing their families only during breaks between assignments. They came from around the world. Officers, often from Italy and other European nations, service staff, frequently from the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and Eastern Europe. They formed their own community aboard, with hierarchies and social dynamics invisible to the passengers they served. Laundry facilities processed tons of linens daily. Bed sheets, towels, tablecloths, napkins, and crew uniforms. Storage rooms held supplies, food, beverages, cleaning products, spare parts, and the 1,000 other items necessary to keep a floating city operational. Medical facilities included an infirmary staffed by doctors and nurses, capable of handling emergencies until the ship could reach port. And then there were the safety systems. Modern cruise ships are designed to survive damage that would have sunk earlier vessels. Their hulls are divided into watertight compartments, separated by heavy steel bulkheads that can be sealed in an emergency. The theory is simple and proven. If the hull is breached, water floods only the damaged compartments. As long as enough compartments remain watertight, the ship stays afloat. The Titanic, despite her reputation, was actually designed with this system. Her failure came because the iceberg damaged too many compartments simultaneously, exceeding the ship's design tolerance. Costa Concordia's design called for her to remain stable even with several compartments flooded. Her hull was subdivided into multiple watertight sections, each capable of being isolated from the others. Pumps could remove water from flooded spaces. Backup systems existed for critical functions. The ship was built to survive substantial damage. Her lifeboats, those distinctive orange capsules visible along the sides of any cruise ship, could accommodate all passengers and crew with capacity to spare. International regulations required this redundancy. Costa Concordia exceeded the requirements. The boats were mounted on davits, mechanical arms that could swing them out over the water and lower them to the surface. Crew members trained regularly on deployment procedures. Life jackets filled storage lockers throughout the passenger areas, enough for everyone aboard plus extras. Muster stations, designated assembly points where passengers would gather in an emergency, were located throughout the ship, their positions marked on cabin doors and throughout public spaces. The safety drill conducted at the beginning of each voyage was meant to familiarize passengers with these stations and with the procedures they would follow if the alarm ever sounded for real. Emergency generators were positioned to take over if main power failed. They would keep critical systems running. Emergency lighting, communication equipment, navigation systems, and the pumps that could mean the difference between a damaged ship and a sinking one. The bridge featured state-of-the-art navigation systems, including GPS, radar, electronic chart displays, and automated alarms that could warn of approaching hazards. Every system was designed for safety. Every procedure was meant to protect lives. The ship was built to the most rigorous international standards, inspected regularly, and operated by a company with decades of experience. And none of it mattered, because in the end, safety isn't really about equipment or design. It's about the people who operate those systems. It's about the decisions they make, the procedures they follow, the judgment they exercise when circumstances demand more than routine. And on January 13, 2012, the wrong person was in command. Francesco Schettino was born in Naples in November 1960 into a family with generations of seafaring tradition. His hometown of Meta di Sorrento, a picturesque village on the Amalfi Coast south of Naples, had produced sailors and captains for centuries. The sea was visible from nearly every window. Boys grew up watching fishing boats and ferries traverse the Bay of Naples. Many followed their fathers and grandfathers into maritime careers. The sea was in their blood, as locals like to say. Schettino trained at the Istituto Tecnico Nautico Nino Bixio in Piano di Sorrento, one of Italy's respected maritime academies. The curriculum combined classroom instruction with practical training, preparing students for careers as ship's officers. After graduation, he worked for Tirrenia, a ferry company operating routes between the Italian mainland, Sardinia, and Sicily. It was solid, unglamorous work, navigating familiar routes, loading and unloading vehicles, keeping schedules that repeated week after week. But it built experience. Schettino had ambitions beyond ferries. The cruise industry was expanding rapidly, offering better pay, international routes, and the prestige of commanding vessels that were small cities rather than simple transportation. In April 2002, at age 41, he joined Costa Concordia. He started in security, working his way up through the officer ranks. His evaluations were apparently satisfactory. He advanced steadily through positions of increasing responsibility. He served as second in command, gaining experience in the operational aspects of cruise ship management. And in 2006, he received the position every maritime officer dreams of, captain of his own ship. The ship was the brand new Costa Concordia. By the accounts of those who worked with him, Schettino was charming. He dressed impeccably, favoring well-tailored uniforms, and maintaining the appearance expected of a cruise ship captain. He cultivated a debonair image, comfortable in the social role that the position required. Unlike cargo ship captains, who might spend entire voyages isolated on the bridge, cruise ship captains were expected to mingle with passengers, to appear at dinners and events, to embody the hospitality that the cruise line promised. Schettino seemed to enjoy this aspect of command. Passengers remembered a captain who appeared at dinner, who posed for photographs, who projected the confidence you want to see in the man responsible for your safety at sea. He was personable, engaging, the kind of authority figure who put people at ease. But other patterns emerged as well. Colleagues described him as risk-tolerant, perhaps excessively so. He was confident in his abilities, confident enough, as he would later say, to navigate by sight because he knew the waters so well. He had a showman's instinct, a desire to create memorable moments for passengers, to provide experiences that would distinguish his voyages from routine cruises. The warning signs accumulated gradually. In November 2008, when Costa Concordia was caught in a storm while docked at Palermo, Sicily, high winds pushed the ship against the pier, damaging her bow. Schettino was in command. There were no injuries, and repairs were completed within a month, but the incident stayed on his record. Questions might have been raised about whether the ship should have been positioned differently, whether the moorings were adequate, whether the captain had made the right calls as conditions deteriorated. In 2010, while captaining another Costa ship, the Costa Atlantica, Schettino allegedly entered the port of Warnemünde, Germany, at excessive speed, damaging another Carnival Corporation vessel, the Ada Blue. The companies later disputed whether the incident actually caused damage, but it was another mark suggesting a captain who pushed limits, who trusted his judgment perhaps more than circumstances warranted. None of this prevented his continued command. The cruise industry, like many businesses, faced pressure to maintain schedules and manage costs. Captains who delivered on time, who kept passengers happy, who didn't create problems that reached corporate headquarters, these were valued employees. And whatever his faults, Schettino kept passengers happy. He was good at the social side of the job, the part that cruise lines market most heavily. What the passengers didn't see, couldn't see, was what happened on the bridge. The decisions made in those quiet moments when the captain took the helm. The calculations about how close was too close. The assumptions about what the rules really meant and when they could be bent. There was a tradition in the cruise industry known as the salute. When a ship passed close to shore, near a significant landmark, or the hometown of a crew member or company official, the captain might steer, closer than normal, give a blast of the horn, and let passengers enjoy an impressive view. It was a gesture of showmanship, a way to create a memorable moment, a photo opportunity that passengers would share with friends and family back home. And it was controversial. Navigation charts exist for a reason. They show not just where the land is, but where rocks and shoals lurk beneath the surface. Hazards invisible from the bridge, but perfectly capable of tearing open a ship's hull. When a vessel leaves its planned route and ventures close to shore, it enters waters that may not have been surveyed to the same rigorous standards as established shipping lanes. The charts may be incomplete. The depths may be uncertain. Hazards may exist that no one has documented. Costa Concordia had procedures for salutes. They required captains to submit proposed routes to company headquarters for approval, to maintain specified minimum distances from shore, to conduct these maneuvers only in daylight with good visibility. The company knew these close passes were risky. They understood the dangers of approaching unfamiliar shorelines, but they also knew passengers loved them. The photographs, the excitement, the sense of adventure, these were valuable marketing tools. And so the practice continued, regulated but not prohibited, a compromise between safety and spectacle. Schettino had performed salutes before, including at Giglio Island. In August 2011, just 5 months before the disaster, Costa Concordia had made a similar close pass off Giglio, with company approval according to some reports, though this would later become disputed. The maneuver had gone smoothly. The passengers had enjoyed spectacular views of the Italian coastline. Schettino had demonstrated his skill at handling the massive vessel in confined waters. No one had died. Perhaps that earlier success bred complacency. Perhaps Schettino simply believed his own judgment was better than the charts. Perhaps the pressure to create memorable moments outweighed his caution about the risks involved. Whatever the reason, when Costa Concordia set sail from Civitavecchia on January 13, 2012, her captain had already decided to give the passengers a show. The evening of Friday, January 13th, was calm and overcast. Costa Concordia had departed Civitavecchia, the port that serves Rome, at approximately 7:18 p.m. local time. She carried 3,229 passengers and 1,023 crew members from more than 70 countries. Families from Italy, Germany, France, and Spain. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Groups of friends on holiday. The demographics typical of a Mediterranean winter cruise. Heavy on Europeans, with a scattering of Americans, Asians, and South Americans. For most passengers, the evening began like any cruise vacation. The excitement of embarkation, finding your cabin, testing the bed, opening the closet to begin unpacking, exploring the ship's endless corridors, discovering the restaurants and bars and lounges that would be your neighborhood for the next week. Meeting fellow passengers in the buffet line or at the pool bar, exchanging stories about where you were from and what you hoped to see. The dress code that first night was casual, appropriate for embarkation day. The formal nights would come later in the voyage. Tonight, passengers wore comfortable clothes as they settled in, finding their sea legs, learning the ship's geography. By 9 p.m., the main dining rooms were in full operation. Waiters in black vests and white shirts moved between tables, taking orders, pouring wine, delivering plates. The menus offered multiple courses: appetizers, soups, salads, main dishes, desserts. Italian specialties featured prominently. This was a Costa ship, after all, but international options were available for less adventurous palates. The dining rooms buzzed with the multilingual conversation of a European vacation crowd. In the buffet areas, passengers who preferred casual dining served themselves from dozens of stations. Carved meats steamed under heat lamps, pasta dishes in various sauces, fresh vegetables, pizza emerging from ovens, dessert stations with cakes and pastries and gelato. Parents wrangled children who wanted to try everything at once. In the theater, the evening's entertainment was underway. In the casino, cards were being dealt and slot machines were chiming. In the bars, passengers nursed drinks and watched the dark ocean through salt-sprayed windows. It was exactly what a cruise vacation was supposed to be: pleasant, relaxed, insulated from the concerns of everyday life. The ship took care of everything. You just had to enjoy yourself. On the bridge, Schettino was preparing his salute to Giglio Island. The island sits in the Tyrrhenian Sea, about 11 miles off the Tuscan coast. It's small, roughly 8 square miles, and home to only about 1,400 permanent residents, most of them dependent on fishing and the summer tourist season. The main settlement, Giglio Porto, features a small harbor, a medieval fortress, and the kind of picturesque Italian scenery that cruise passengers photograph obsessively. The standard shipping route from Civitavecchia passes well to the east of Giglio, in deep water where charts are reliable and hazards are well documented. But Schettino wasn't planning to take the standard route. Off the island's eastern coast, a cluster of rocks called Le Scole extends underwater from the shoreline. The outermost of these rocks, Scola Piccola, rises from the seabed but remains submerged, its peak about 8 meters below the surface at low tide. It's marked on navigation charts. Any competent mariner reviewing the charts before approaching Giglio would know it was there. At normal cruising distance, these rocks pose no danger whatsoever, but if you wanted to pass close enough to shore for passengers to see the island's lights clearly, close enough to make a real impression, to create the kind of moment that people remember, then Le Scole became relevant, very relevant. Schettino programmed a course change into the ship's navigation system. The exact route he intended remains disputed, but the plan called for passing much closer than the standard charts recommended, possibly within 500 meters of shore, threading between the island and the underwater rocks that extended from it. What Schettino apparently didn't do was submit this route for company approval as procedures required. What he apparently didn't consider carefully enough was the margin for error when navigating a 114,000-ton vessel within hundreds of meters of submerged rocks. And what he would later admit was that he turned off the ship's automated navigation alarm, the system designed to warn when a vessel approaches charted hazards, because he was navigating by sight. He knew these waters, he believed. He could see the island ahead. He didn't need a computer to tell him where the rocks were. By 9:30 p.m., dinner service was in full swing throughout the ship. The main courses were being served. Wine was being poured. Children were growing restless in their seats. Couples were talking about what they might do when the ship reached Savona the next day. Life aboard Costa Concordia proceeded in blissful ignorance of what was happening on the bridge above. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Schettino made a call to the ship's maître d'hôtel, a retired Costa captain named Mario Palombo, who lived on Giglio Island. Schettino wanted Palombo to see the salute, to watch the great cruise ship pass close enough to his home that he could almost touch her. The call lasted about 4 minutes. During that time, Costa Concordia continued toward the rocks at full cruising speed, approximately 16 knots, or about 18 miles per hour. The conversation may have been friendly, perhaps nostalgic. 2 captains talking shop, one still at sea, one enjoying retirement on a beautiful Italian island. Meanwhile, the gap between the ship and the underwater reef was closing. At 9:42 p.m., the phone call ended. 8 minutes later, the helmsman, an Indonesian crew member, Jacob Rusli Bin, received orders to steer a specific course. Costa Concordia's bow swung toward Giglio. At 9:45 p.m., someone on the bridge saw something ahead. Rocks, perhaps, or the sea breaking over submerged obstacles. Whatever they saw, it was too late. Schettino ordered an emergency turn to port. The helmsman spun the wheel, but 115,000 tons of steel doesn't turn on a dime. Costa Concordia's momentum carried her forward even as her bow began to swing left. And directly ahead, invisible in the darkness, the granite spur of Scola Piccola waited. The collision was catastrophic. The impact felt like an earthquake. The submerged rocks struck Costa Concordia's port side below the waterline, tearing into the hull with unimaginable force. The ship was traveling at full cruising speed, roughly 16 knots, and the collision sheared off steel plating like a knife through paper. The gash that opened would ultimately measure 53 meters, nearly 174 feet, stretching across 3 engine room compartments. Passengers in the dining rooms heard a tremendous grinding noise, a sound unlike anything most of them had ever experienced. The ship shuddered violently, throwing people off balance, sending dishes sliding across tables to shatter on the floor. Glasses toppled, silverware scattered, wine bottles tumbled from serving stations. The lights flickered once, twice, and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the elegant dining rooms in dim orange glow. The chandeliers that had sparkled moments earlier were now dark shapes overhead. The music stopped. The clamor of dining service was replaced by confused voices, people asking what had happened, whether they should stay or go, what they were supposed to do. The ship's list began almost immediately. As water poured into the breached compartments, the vessel's balance shifted. Tables that had been level now tilted slightly. Passengers felt themselves leaning, compensating for an angle that grew worse by the minute. At first, many assumed it was a technical problem. The crew initially told passengers that the ship had experienced an electrical failure and that the situation was under control. An announcement over the public address system instructed passengers to remain calm and return to their cabins. Some crew members used the word blackout. Stay in your room, everything is fine. The situation is being addressed. For perhaps 15 minutes, this fiction held. Passengers made their way through tilted corridors, holding handrails that were suddenly necessary, returning to cabins that now felt wrong somehow. Some began to worry, others trusted the reassurances. The crew seemed calm. Surely if it were serious, someone would tell them. But on the bridge, the reality was already clear. The head of the engine room had rushed to warn Schettino that the hull was torn open along a 35-meter length and that water was flooding in unstoppably. The diesel generators were underwater. The engines had stopped. The ship had no propulsion, no steering, and limited emergency systems. Costa Concordia was dying. What happened next remains controversial and was extensively documented in the subsequent investigation. According to investigators, Schettino initially tried to conceal the severity of the situation. When the Coast Guard called the ship at 10:12 p.m., having received reports from passengers who had called family members on their cell phones, Schettino allegedly told them the situation was a blackout and that he was assessing conditions. The Coast Guard, relying on the captain's assessment, did not immediately dispatch rescue resources. The timeline assembled later by Italian investigators tells a damning story. At 9:45 p.m., the ship struck the rocks. The hull was breached. The engine rooms began to flood. At 10:12 p.m., 27 minutes after impact, the Coast Guard called asking what was happening. Schettino, according to transcripts, described the situation as a blackout. At 10:22 p.m., Schettino finally told the Coast Guard there was a failure and requested tugboat assistance. He mentioned that passengers had life jackets, but said no one was injured. The Coast Guard still didn't know the full extent of the emergency. At 10:33 p.m., 48 minutes after impact, Schettino gave the order for passengers to go to their muster stations. This was the assembly point where passengers would receive instructions during an emergency, typically the same location where they participated in the mandatory safety drill at the beginning of each cruise. But Costa Concordia had left port only hours earlier. The mandatory drill hadn't been conducted yet. Many passengers had no idea where their muster station was, what they were supposed to do when they got there, or how to find a life jacket. They fumbled through unfamiliar corridors, increasingly tilted, poorly lit, trying to follow crew members who were themselves struggling to manage a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. At 10:50 p.m., more than an hour after impact, Schettino finally gave the order to abandon ship. By that point, the list had grown severe. What had started as a slight tilt was now a dramatic lean to starboard, the ship heeling over at angles that made normal movement nearly impossible. The floor had become a slope. Walls had become obstacles to climb around. Furniture that wasn't bolted down had slid across rooms, piling up against the low side. For passengers, the next hours were chaos. The ship's design, like all cruise ships, assumed that evacuation would occur from a roughly level vessel. Lifeboats hung from davits on both sides of the ship, designed to be swung outward and lowered to the water. This procedure works well when the ship is upright. When the ship is listing at 40, 50, 60 degrees, it becomes nearly impossible. On the high side, the port side, which was now angled up toward the sky, the lifeboats hung too far from the hull for passengers to board. The davits could swing them outward, but the distance between the boat and the ship was too great to bridge safely. Passengers would have had to jump across open space to reach them. On the low side, the starboard side, now nearly in the water, the lifeboats scraped against the ship's tilting hull. Some couldn't be lowered at all. Others launched successfully, but dragged along the ship's surface, their orange hulls grinding against steel as they descended. Corridors that had been horizontal were now tilted slopes. Passengers who had been on the high side of the ship faced treacherous descents across wet, slippery floors, holding on to anything they could grab, handrails, door frames, pipes, as they worked their way toward the lifeboats. Those on the low side found themselves wading through water that was rising with each passing minute, searching for exits that weren't blocked. The darkness compounded every problem. Emergency lighting provided only dim illumination. Many areas of the ship were completely black. Passengers stumbled over debris they couldn't see, collided with obstacles, lost their orientation in spaces that no longer made sense. Children screamed. Parents shouted for family members they had been separated from. Elderly passengers struggled to navigate terrain that would have challenged athletes. Crew members did their best to direct traffic, to keep people moving toward the boats, but the chaos was overwhelming. Some crew members showed remarkable heroism. They stayed at their posts, helping passengers find life jackets and muster stations, directing evacuation, even as the situation deteriorated. One crew member, a young Italian officer named Simone Canessa, worked alongside rescuers until nearly 5:30 a.m., helping to coordinate the evacuation. A waiter was last seen helping passengers reach the lifeboats. His body was later found inside the ship. Others were less impressive. Reports emerged of crew members pushing past passengers to reach lifeboats, of conflicting instructions that added to the confusion, of language barriers that prevented effective communication. The crew was multinational. Officers from Italy, service staff from the Philippines, Indonesia, India, Eastern Europe, and not everyone spoke the same language fluently. In a crisis, this created dangerous miscommunication. The island's residents responded with astonishing speed and courage. Giglio is a small place, and word of the disaster spread almost instantly. Within minutes of the collision, fishermen were launching their boats. Private pleasure craft put out from the harbor. The island's ferry captain, who was off duty when the crash occurred, raced to the port and took his vessel out to help. Commercial boats, tour boats, anything that floated, all of it converged on the stricken liner. These local heroes pulled passengers from the water, plucked them from ropes they had climbed down the ship's side, ferried them from lifeboats that had launched successfully to the safety of shore. The Italian Coast Guard dispatched helicopters and rescue swimmers, who descended onto the tilting decks to help evacuate passengers who couldn't reach the boats. By 3:05 a.m., ferries were evacuating passengers from Giglio's small harbor to the mainland at Porto Santo Stefano. The island's population of 1,400 suddenly had to accommodate thousands of shocked, wet, traumatized survivors. Schools and churches opened their doors. Residents brought blankets, food, and dry clothing. It was an extraordinary display of community response in the face of catastrophe. And through all of this, Captain Schettino was no longer aboard his ship. According to investigators, Schettino left Costa Concordia at approximately 11:30 p.m. While hundreds of passengers were still aboard, while crew members were still struggling to launch lifeboats, while the ship he commanded was still dying. He would later claim that he fell into a lifeboat when the ship lurched, that he hadn't intended to leave, that circumstances had carried him away from his duty. Crew members and Coast Guard officials found this explanation unconvincing. The recorded conversation between Schettino and Coast Guard Captain Gregorio De Falco has become one of the most famous exchanges in maritime history. De Falco, coordinating rescue operations from the Livorno Port Authority, repeatedly ordered Schettino to return to his ship and oversee the evacuation. Schettino made excuses. It was dark. He couldn't see. The lifeboat had stopped. There were other rescuers handling things. He was coordinating from where he was. De Falco's responses grew increasingly furious. "Get on board! It is an order! Don't make any more excuses! You have declared abandoned ship! Now I am in command! What are you coordinating there? Go on board! Coordinate the rescue from aboard the ship! Are you refusing? There are already bodies, Schettino! Go!" And finally, the line that echoed around the world. "Vada a bordo, cazzo!" Get back on board, damn it! Or, depending on translation, something considerably stronger. Schettino never returned. By 4:46 a.m., the evacuation was officially declared complete, but the count was devastating. Of the 4,152 people known to have been aboard Costa Concordia, 32 were dead or missing. 27 passengers and 5 crew members lost their lives. Some drowned inside the flooding ship. Others died from injuries sustained during the chaotic evacuation. Some bodies weren't recovered for months or years. Among the dead was a 5-year-old Italian girl named Diana Arloti, who had been on the cruise with her father. An American couple from Minnesota, Gerald and Barbara Hale, celebrating their retirement. A Hungarian violinist named Sandor Feher, who had been working as a musician aboard. A young Peruvian waiter named Erica Soria Molina, who was last seen helping passengers to the lifeboats. 32 people who had boarded a vacation cruise expecting safety and relaxation. 32 people whose families would spend years seeking justice, seeking answers, seeking some way to make sense of a tragedy that should never have happened. When the sun rose on January 14, 2012, television crews broadcast images that seemed impossible in the modern age. Costa Concordia lay on her starboard side, her massive hull half submerged in about 20 meters of water, her port side exposed to the sky like the belly of a dead whale. The ship had come to rest on a rocky underwater ledge at Punta Gabbianara, roughly 300 meters from shore. Satellite dishes, deck furniture, and debris littered the water around her. One of the ship's propellers was visible above the surface. The orange lifeboats that had carried survivors to safety were scattered across the harbor. The visual impact was staggering. This wasn't some rust bucket freighter lost in a storm. This was a state-of-the-art cruise ship, larger and more modern than the Titanic, dead in the water within swimming distance of an Italian island. A floating city of restaurants, theaters, spas, and luxury suites reduced to a half-sunken monument to human error. The image became iconic instantly. Photographers captured the wreck from every angle, from shore, from boats circling the exclusion zone, from helicopters hovering overhead. The contrast was devastating. The gleaming white superstructure, designed to convey luxury and safety, now lying broken and helpless against the rocky Italian coast. It was an image that would define discussions of maritime safety for years to come. The Italian government declared a state of emergency. Francesco Schettino was arrested within hours and initially held on charges of multiple manslaughter, causing a shipwreck and abandoning ship. The international media descended on Giglio, broadcasting the disaster to hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide. Within days, T-shirts bearing DeFalco's famous phrase were selling across Italy. Vada a bordo, cazzo became a national rallying cry, a rebuke not just to Schettino, but to what many Italians saw as a broader culture of irresponsibility among their leaders. The phrase appeared on coffee mugs, bumper stickers, and internet memes. DeFalco, the balding, soft-spoken Coast Guard captain who had screamed at Schettino to do his duty, became an instant folk hero. Years later, he would be elected to the Italian Senate. Schettino's public image, meanwhile, could hardly have been worse. The tabloids dubbed him Captain Coward and Captain Calamity. His claim about falling into a lifeboat was widely mocked. A new Italian expression entered the language. Fare lo schettino, to do a schettino, meaning to abandon your responsibilities when things get difficult. Reports emerged that a young Moldovan dancer, Domnica Comortin, had been on the bridge with him during the approach to Giglio, and that she and Schettino had been romantically involved. Comortin later admitted to the affair in court testimony. The investigation that followed revealed a cascade of failures that extended beyond one reckless captain. Costa Concordia, it emerged, had known about the salute tradition and had at least partially tolerated it. The company had procedures for approved close passes, which meant the practice wasn't entirely forbidden, just regulated. This created dangerous ambiguity. Where exactly was the line between an acceptable salute and an unauthorized risk? Captains who had performed these maneuvers successfully before might reasonably believe they understood the limits. The company's implicit acceptance of the practice undermined the safety culture it claimed to maintain. Bridge resource management, the protocols by which officers communicate, cross-check decisions, and challenge unsafe actions, had apparently broken down completely. No one on the bridge effectively challenged Schettino's decision to approach Giglio so closely. The other officers deferred to the captain's authority. The helmsman, Jacob Rusli Bin, would later be cited for communication difficulties. Some accounts suggested he didn't fully understand Schettino's orders, which may have been given in Italian, rather than the maritime standard of English. The safety drill that should have been conducted before departure had been postponed. International regulations required it, but the drill had been scheduled for later in the voyage. Passengers hadn't been shown their muster stations, hadn't practiced putting on life jackets, hadn't walked the routes they would need to follow in an emergency. When the evacuation order came, many didn't know where to go. Costa Concordia's design, while meeting all regulatory requirements, created challenges for an angled evacuation that the designers had never anticipated. The ship's massive size and the extreme list made traditional lifeboat deployment nearly impossible on one side. Corridors and stairways became treacherous obstacle courses. Emergency lighting that was adequate for a level ship was disorienting in a vessel tilted at 60 degrees. The crew, while many showed remarkable bravery, hadn't been adequately trained for a disaster of this magnitude. They had practiced routine drills, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of evacuating thousands of passengers from a dark, listing ship in the middle of the night. Communication broke down. Commands were lost in translation. The hierarchy that normally maintained order dissolved into confusion. And then there was Schettino himself, his decision to navigate by sight, his deactivation of the automated warning systems, his delay in calling for help, his apparent lies to the Coast Guard about the severity of the situation, his abandonment of the ship while passengers were still aboard. Each decision compounded the disaster, turning what might have been a serious incident into a catastrophic loss of life. The legal proceedings took years. In July 2013, 5 Costa crew members and the company's crisis coordinator pleaded guilty to various charges, receiving sentences ranging from 18 months to just under 3 years. None served significant time. Costa Concordia itself accepted limited responsibility in April 2013 and paid a fine of €1 million, a tiny fraction of the disaster's total cost, less than 0.1% of the eventual cleanup bill. Schettino's trial began in July 2013 and lasted 19 months. His lawyers argued that he was being made a scapegoat, that the helmsman shared responsibility for the navigation error, that Costa's corporate culture had encouraged risk-taking and showmanship, that the company's procedures were inadequate, that the ship's design contributed to the evacuation problems. Schettino himself insisted that his actions after the grounding had actually saved lives, that his decision to turn the ship toward shore prevented it from sinking in deeper water where rescue would have been impossible. In February 2015, an Italian court rejected these arguments. Francesco Schettino was found guilty of multiple manslaughter, causing a shipwreck and abandoning ship with passengers still aboard. His sentence, 16 years in prison. He exhausted his appeals in 2017, when Italy's highest court upheld the conviction and began serving his sentence at Rebibbia prison in Rome. As of 2025, Schettino had served more than half his sentence. Reports indicated he was working on digitizing legal documents as part of a rehabilitation program. He had applied for partial parole, seeking permission to work outside the prison during the day. The families of his victims watched these proceedings with varying degrees of outrage. One father, whose son had died in the disaster, told reporters that Schettino should serve 32 life sentences, one for each victim. But the physical presence of Costa Concordia remained. For nearly 2.5 years after the disaster, the ship lay on her side off Giglio Island, a daily reminder to the island's 1,400 residents of the night their lives had been upended. The wreck became a macabre tourist attraction, drawing gawkers who photographed the half-sunken vessel from the shore and from boats that circled the exclusion zone. Some residents resented the attention. Others saw opportunity in it. The island had never had a year-round tourist season before, and now visitors came even in winter, drawn by the spectacle of the broken ship. But Costa Concordia couldn't simply be abandoned. Her fuel tanks held over 2,300 tons of diesel and other petroleum products. The environmental threat to Giglio's pristine waters, part of a protected nature reserve, home to dolphins and diverse marine life, was severe and ongoing. Any major leak could devastate the local ecosystem and the fishing and tourism industries that depended on it. Beyond the ecological risk, the ship was physically unstable. She rested on a rocky underwater ledge at the edge of a slope that dropped to nearly 100 meters. If she slipped from her precarious perch, she would slide into deep water, likely breaking apart in the process and spilling fuel across a wide area. The longer she sat there, the weaker her structure became, corroded by salt water, battered by waves, slowly collapsing under stresses her designers had never anticipated. The wreck, had to be removed. The question was how? The salvage operation that followed became the largest and most expensive in maritime history. A consortium of Titan Salvage, an American company owned by Crowley Maritime, and Perry, an Italian marine engineering firm, won the contract to remove the wreck. 7 companies had competed for the job, each proposing different approaches. Titan and Perry's plan was audacious. They would rotate the massive vessel upright using a technique called parbuckling, then float her off the seabed and tow her to a shipyard for scrapping. Parbuckling is an old maritime technique, essentially using cables looped under a capsized vessel to roll it back to vertical. It had been used successfully on smaller ships and submarines, but it had never been attempted on a vessel anywhere near the size of Costa Concordia. The engineering challenges were formidable beyond anything the salvage industry had faced. The ship weighed over 114,000 gross tons. Her hull had been damaged not only by the grounding, but by 20 months of exposure to currents, waves, corrosion, and the stresses of lying on her side. The rocky seabed offered uncertain support. The ledge on which she rested could shift or crumble. One wrong calculation, one unexpected failure, and the ship could break apart or slide into deep water, triggering exactly the environmental catastrophe everyone was trying to prevent. The salvage team assembled over 500 workers from around the world, engineers from the United States, Italy, the Netherlands, South Africa, and a dozen other nations. Divers who could work in the murky, debris-filled waters around the wreck. Welders who could operate underwater, attaching steel structures to a rusting hull. Riggers, crane operators, technicians, biologists monitoring the environmental impact. Safety officers tracking risks that multiplied daily. They began with the fuel. Dutch salvage company Smit was brought in to pump out Costa Concordia's 17 fuel tanks, a more complex operation than it sounds. Draining the tanks would shift the vessel's equilibrium, potentially causing it to roll off the ledge. Water had to be injected as fuel was removed, maintaining the ship's balance while eliminating the most immediate environmental threat. The process took months, complicated by bad weather and the difficulty of accessing damaged compartments. By March 2012, the defueling was complete. Over 2,300 tons of petroleum products had been safely removed. Then came the massive construction project that would prepare the ship for parbuckling. An artificial underwater platform had to be built on the downhill side of the wreck. 6 massive steel structures, anchored to the granite seabed, designed to catch the ship as she rolled upright. The platform had to support 175,000 tons, remain stable on a sloping seabed, and survive the extreme forces that would be generated during the rotation. Each of the 6 sections was manufactured onshore, transported to the site by barge, and positioned by divers working in near-zero visibility. Between the platform sections and the natural rock, engineers injected thousands of tons of grout, a cement mixture that filled gaps and created a stable surface. Grout bags, filled with the equivalent of 30,000 tons of cement, were placed to support the hull during and after the rotation. The seabed that would receive Costa Concordia's weight was literally reconstructed by human hands. On the exposed side of the ship, the port side, which had been above water since the grounding, workers welded enormous steel boxes called sponsons. These were hollow structures, most of them 10 stories high and weighing up to 500 tons each. 11 sponsons were attached to the port side, initially to act as counterweights during the rotation. They would be filled with water as the ship rolled, using gravity to assist the movement. Later, the same sponsons would be pumped full of air to help refloat the wreck. The statistics were staggering. 31,000 tons of steel fabricated and transported to the site. 18,000 tons of grout injected into the seabed. 9 tons of welding rod consumed. 33 kilometers of welds laid by divers working underwater. 120 divers rotated through the operation. 30 vessels supported the work at any given time. 3 supercomputers ran for weeks to model every aspect of the operation, simulating forces and stresses and failure modes. And the cost? Initial estimates of $300 million quickly proved optimistic. By the time parbuckling was attempted, the salvage operation alone had exceeded 600 million euros, roughly $800 million. The total cost of the disaster, including victim compensation, the salvage, towing, and scrapping, would eventually surpass $2 billion, more than 3 times what it had cost to build the ship in the first place. On September 16, 2013, 20 months after the disaster, the parbuckling began. The operation started at 9:30 a.m. local time, delayed 3 hours by an overnight storm that had interrupted final preparations. Engineers gathered in a control room filled with monitors, watching live feeds from cameras attached to remotely operated vehicles, tracking stress measurements from sensors throughout the hull. This was the moment of truth. Everything they had built, everything they had calculated, would now be tested. 48 cables, looped under the hull and attached to the sponsons, were connected to giant hydraulic jacks mounted on the artificial platform. At the signal, the jacks began to pull. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, just a few centimeters at a time, the wreck began to move. The most dangerous moment came immediately. The ship had to be freed from the rock spurs on which she'd been resting for 20 months. Her hull had settled into this position, perhaps even fused slightly to the granite. Too much force too quickly could tear the weakened structure apart. Too little force would leave her stuck. The engineers had to strike a precise balance, applying pressure gradually, watching for any sign of structural failure. For hours, the operation proceeded. The ship rotated at a rate of about 3 meters per hour, barely perceptible to observers, but tracked precisely by instruments. On the exposed side, water was pumped into the sponsons, adding weight that helped gravity pull the ship toward vertical. Oil booms surrounded the work area, ready to contain any spills. Environmental monitors watched for contamination. Television crews broadcast the operation live to audiences around the world. By late afternoon, Costa Concordia had rotated past the most critical angle, about 24 degrees from her resting position. Beyond this point, the physics changed. The sponsons could take over, their increasing weight pulling the ship the rest of the way to vertical without further need of the cables and jacks. Valves were opened. Seawater flooded into the sponsons. The rotation accelerated. At 3 a.m. on September 17, 2013, Costa Concordia stood upright for the first time since the disaster. The salvage team erupted in celebration. After years of planning, months of construction, and 19 hours of parbuckling, they had done what many experts had said was impossible. The whole team is proud of what they achieved, said salvage master Nick Sloan, a South African engineer who had coordinated the operation, because a lot of people didn't think it could be done. As the ship's starboard side emerged from the water for the first time in 20 months, the extent of the damage became visible. Brown marine growth covered every surface. Rust streaked the once white hull. The impact point was clearly visible, a massive indentation where the ship had struck the rocks, surrounded by torn and twisted steel. This was the wound that had killed Costa Concordia, now exposed for the world to see. The following months brought more work. The hull had to be stabilized. 15 additional sponsons were attached to the starboard side. Holes and breaches had to be patched. The ship had to be prepared for refloating and the long tow to her final destination. On July 23, 2014, Costa Concordia was finally refloated. Air was pumped into the sponsons, gradually lifting the wreck off the underwater platform until she floated, barely, on her own. She rode low in the water, her hull still badly damaged, but she floated. For the first time in 2.5 years, Costa Concordia was a ship again, at least technically. The tow began that same day. 14 vessels escorted the wreck on a 4-day, 320-kilometer journey to the port of Genoa. 2 powerful tugs pulled from the front, maintaining a distance of 700 to 800 meters. The convoy moved at walking pace, just 2.5 knots, navigating carefully to avoid any further damage. Environmental monitors watched for leaks. Salvage engineers remained aboard the wreck, ready to respond to any emergency. Greenpeace observers documented the operation's environmental impact. On July 27, 2014, the wreck arrived at its final destination, Molo ex Superbacino in the port of Genoa. The dismantling process would take another 3 years. A consortium of Saipem and San Giorgio del Porto, calling themselves the Ship Recycling Consortium, had won the contract to scrap the vessel. The work employed up to 250 people at a time, cutting the massive hull into sections, separating materials for recycling, disposing of hazardous waste according to strict environmental regulations. The interior contents, furniture, carpeting, fixtures, all the elements that had made Costa Concordia a floating resort, had to be removed and cataloged. The numbers were impressive, even in destruction. 50,000 tons of steel recovered, 2,000 tons of copper, thousands of tons of other materials, from aluminum to glass to fabric. The scrapping cost exceeded $100 million, bringing the total cost of the disaster past the $2 billion mark. By July 2017, Costa Concordia had been completely dismantled. Nothing remained of the floating city that had carried thousands of vacationers across the Mediterranean. The hull was gone, cut into pieces and melted down. The engines were gone, their massive components recycled or disposed of. The atrium, the restaurants, the theater, the spa, all of it reduced to scrap metal and landfill. 2 memorials now stand on Giglio Island, bearing the names of the 32 people who died. A plaque near the harbor lists their names, their nationalities, their ages. It includes not only the passengers and crew who died on January 13, 2012, but also a Spanish salvage diver who was fatally injured while working on the wreck removal in 2014, the 33rd casualty of a disaster that should never have happened. The Costa Concordia disaster changed the cruise industry in ways both immediate and lasting. Within weeks of the grounding, the Cruise Lines International Association, the industry's main trade body, announced new policies. All embarking passengers would be required to participate in safety drills before departure. No exceptions, no delays, no scheduling the drill for later in the voyage. Ships would be required to carry additional life jackets beyond the already mandated supply. Bridge officers would be required to agree formally on navigation routes before leaving port, creating accountability that might prevent a lone captain from making unilateral course changes. Access to the bridge during critical maneuvers would be restricted to essential personnel only. These changes address specific failures exposed by the disaster: the postponed safety drill, the lack of bridge crew intervention, the ease with which Schettino had altered course without oversight. Each new regulation was a lesson learned from Costa Concordia, written into the operating procedures of every major cruise line. But the new regulations couldn't address the fundamental question that Costa Concordia raised. What happens when a captain simply ignores the rules? Modern cruise ships are marvels of engineering. Their navigation systems can track hazards with remarkable precision. Their safety equipment exceeds every regulatory requirement. Their crews are trained, their routes are planned, their operations are monitored by sophisticated management systems that can detect deviations from normal procedures. But a captain who turns off the automated warnings, who navigates by sight because he's confident in his own judgment, who decides that tonight he'll take a different route to give the passengers a show, that captain can defeat every safety system ever devised. Technology can't prevent human decisions, Equipment can't override human arrogance. Procedures are only as effective as the people who follow them. The cruise industry has grown enormously since 2012. Ships have gotten larger, carrying more passengers, offering more amenities, featuring innovations that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. The biggest cruise vessels now exceed 230,000 gross tons and can accommodate over 6,000 passengers, more than twice the size of Costa Concordia. They feature water parks, ice and skating rinks, roller coasters, and neighborhoods of specialty restaurants. They are floating cities that make Costa Concordia look modest by comparison. They remain, statistically, remarkably safe. Major disasters are rare. Serious incidents involving loss of life are extraordinarily uncommon, given the millions of passengers who cruise each year. The industry's safety record, measured by passenger hours at sea, compares favorably to almost any form of transportation. But Costa Concordia demonstrated that statistics are cold comfort when you're the one climbing down a tilted deck in the dark, looking for a lifeboat that won't launch, wondering if anyone is coming to help. Statistics don't protect you when the captain makes a bad decision. Statistics don't account for the human factor, the unpredictable variable that no regulation can eliminate. Today, if you sail past Isola del Giglio on a clear day, you'll see a small island of steep hillsides and terracotta roofs, a harbor where fishing boats tie up alongside pleasure craft, the ruins of an ancient Roman villa visible on the headland. The medieval fortress still stands watch over Giglio Porto. The clear blue waters that made this island famous among divers and snorkelers have returned to their pristine state. There is no physical trace of what happened here, no broken hull, no twisted metal. The artificial seabed that supported Costa Concordia during the salvage has been removed. The marine flora that was damaged by fuel and debris has been replanted. Environmental monitoring shows that the ecosystem has largely recovered. Dolphins have been spotted in waters where the wreck once lay. Tuna have returned to feeding grounds they abandoned during the years of salvage operations. The island's residents have returned to their normal lives, or something close to it. The summer tourists still come, drawn by the beaches and the diving and the Italian village charm. The fishing boats still go out each morning. The ferry still runs to Porto Santo Stefano on the mainland. Giglio has resumed being what it was before January 2012, a quiet, beautiful place where not much happens. Just the memorials remain. The plaque bearing 32 names, the annual commemorations, the memories that survivors carry, and the grief that families of victims will never fully escape, and the questions that Costa Concordia still asks of everyone who hears her story. The question isn't whether one captain made bad decisions on one January night. Of course he did. The courts established that, the evidence proved it, and Francesco Schettino is serving his sentence. The question is larger than one man. It's about the systems we build and the assumptions we make. About the gap between what we design for and what actually happens. About whether a ship that meets every safety standard is actually safe when the person in command believes rules don't apply to him. Costa Concordia had GPS that could track her position to within meters. She had electronic charts showing every hazard in the Mediterranean. She had alarms that would have warned her captain that he was approaching rocks. Alarms that he turned off because he was confident he knew better. She had a bridge full of officers who might have questioned his decisions. Officers who stayed silent out of deference to his authority. She had procedures that should have prevented exactly what happened. Procedures that one man chose to ignore. We build cruise ships larger and more luxurious every year. We pack them with more passengers, more amenities, more technology than ever before. We assure ourselves that modern engineering has made disasters like this impossible, that the safety systems are foolproof, that what happened to Costa Concordia could never happen again. But engineering can't eliminate human judgment. And human judgment remains the most unpredictable variable in any system. The next time you see photographs of a gleaming cruise ship, her pools sparkling in the Mediterranean sun, her 13 decks rising toward the sky, her theaters and restaurants and spas promising a week of luxury at sea, remember that every ship, no matter how advanced, is captained by a person. A person who might follow every rule and procedure meticulously, or a person who might decide, tonight, that the rules don't apply, that he knows the waters well enough, that the passengers deserve a show. Costa Concordia was built to be unsinkable by anything except the people in charge of her. And that, in the end, was more than enough. If this story has given you something to think about, there are more vessels waiting in the Old World Armada, ships whose stories are equally remarkable, equally tragic, equally instructive about the human relationship with the sea. We'll see you aboard.